we're going to be moving on to another slice of the pie. And here we're going to be focusing on providing economic support and, importantly, economic agency during the transition to adulthood. And we're very grateful to have with us here, we have Devon Gray, who's the president of End Poverty in California. And then we have Amaris Gilbert, who is a youth advocate associated with CalHOPE program, and you're going to hear a lot about the CalHOPE program. Devon and I met at an Aspen event, I think about a year, actually it was just this past fall. I can't remember.
It's been about a year's worth of time.
It certainly has been. Yeah. It has been a long time since January. And we had some really wonderful discussions. I think it was on the top of a roof, watching a crazy drone show in the distance. Remember that? Okay. At any rate, you don't want to hear more about that. But we really connected on sort of this of what's going on that End Poverty in California is doing, the CalHOPE program and so on. And it really represents sort of a very important way to thinking about supporting and providing economic agency for those of us who are making the transition to adulthood, particularly for those of us who are coming from backgrounds in which we do not have as much wealth historically. So could you describe a little bit about your organization, a little bit about the CalHOPE program, and then we'll move on?
Yeah, absolutely. So as Andrew said, I'm Devon Gray, lead an organization called End Poverty in California. We're an advocacy organization that does policy advocacy in the traditional sense, run bills in Sacramento, local pilot programs and the like, conduct research occasionally as well. Also have a big focus on narrative change and storytelling. So with the idea that if we change the underlying beliefs about poverty and its causes and why it impacts certain communities and not others, and change those like cultural beliefs that oftentimes underpin the policy debates, we can take bigger swings for more adventurous policy measures over the medium and long term. A big focus of our advocacy work, though, does focus on income and wealth issues. So we're deeply rooted in the guaranteed income movement. Our founder is the former mayor of Stockton, California, Michael Tubbs, who did the first guaranteed income pilot. But we also have a big focus on asset building because I think and everyone here understands like the distinction between income and wealth. Income being the money that you bring in, wealth being the things that you own, which provides a different type of economic security. And as many folks here probably also know, we have persistent racial wealth gaps and racial income gaps, but the racial wealth gap is in particular quite pernicious for a number of obvious reasons, but we still have a racial wealth gap that is as wide today as it was when the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed. So we have a lot of work to do. So when we are engaging in our advocacy work, one of our big priorities has been thinking about how we can seed wealth into communities that have been systematically disinvested in so that we can ultimately close the wealth gap and the racial wealth gap in particular. And over the last few years, we're a relatively young organization. It's only been about 3 years since we launched. But I think the policy win that I'm most proud of has been successfully passing and now doing the implementation work on the state's first and nation's largest baby bonds program. And for folks who don't know, essentially what a baby bond is trying to, if we draw an analogy to how more affluent children receive intergenerational wealth through trust funds and like the nest egg that comes from their parents, thinking about how the state can intervene to be able to provide a similar type of trust fund for kids who are less affluent. And so over the next handful of months, under a year, we're going to see this program launched where around 58,000 young people across the state will receive roughly $4,500 in a single lump sum payment into a bank account that can be used ideally for wealth building activities, but really there's no restrictions on it. Theoretically, for the wealth building activity, that could be pursuing higher education, startup capital for a business venture, for housing costs or whatever it might be, or you can save it for retirement even, or anything else to meet immediate needs as well. The two main populations that are targeted in this program are children who have been in the foster system for 18 months or more, and Medicaid-eligible children who lost a parent or guardian to COVID during the pandemic. So it's a finite population for now. Obviously, we'd love to expand it, but getting anything done in California is a big accomplishment.
And that was the original goal was something different, and then
yeah,
you went to this.
We started off with the goal of trying to have all Medicaid-eligible children be part of this program. But in a world of scarcity and in a state that has a balanced budget requirement, the price tag just ended up being too much. But this happened in the early part of 2022. The idea of trying to target the population for the program to be folks who sort of by definition have less to inherit because of their familial situation made sense thematically. Foster youth are, I think, a common place where we start programs that can then later expand to other populations. And because we were sort of on the tail end of the pandemic, including COVID-bereaved children as well, made a lot of sense. So we're able to get to, a size for the program that, again, is the largest in the country, and there are many other states and local jurisdictions that have had their own baby bonds program, but we got $130 million in one-time funding to seed the program and $15 million in ongoing funding. And I think a lot of the work that we've been doing with Amaris and other young folks across the state, I'd like to think has protected the program against potential budget cuts, given the fiscal uncertainty that is continually plaguing California, but particularly in the moment that we're in with potential federal budget cuts that could trickle down to the state as well.
Thanks, Devon. That was really a great overview. Can I just ask you something more specific, and then we'll have Amaris talk? Could you talk a little bit more about the importance of wealth at the transition to adulthood and enabling young people to have something there as they make the transition to adulthood? So for just one concrete example, there was already discussion of risk-taking.
Yes.
It's easier to take risks when one has a backup, for example. But can you position it right at this period of life in particular?
It's huge, right? And I think folks here sort of intuitively understand this. Obviously, being able to take a long-term view towards your future requires security in the present, right? Like, it's very difficult to engage in long-term thinking if you're concerned about meeting immediate needs. We know already that young people are predisposed to short-term thinking, just sort of
we've talked
about this, right? And I know Jennifer's not here, but we can sort of get into the social science or into the cognitive science about this as well. But we also know that having financial security and knowing that you're coming into money at a certain point in your life sort of has a forcing function of making it easier to think about your long-term prospects. And therefore, you can make more intentional decisions about what your future is going to entail. Do you want to pursue a higher education? What are your career prospects going to be? Is it wise to engage in savings? Like, all these things make a big difference. But I think, in sort of thematically, and again, I'm not a social scientist, I'm not a cognitive scientist by any means, but I think we sort of, again, intuitively understand that when folks know that the state has invested in them, it makes it much easier to think about, okay, I have a place in society. I can pick my head up and think about what my long-term prospects are because I know that I've received investment, and therefore I can make a return on that investment for yourself.
Great, and we've talked about this, but the real expert is next to you about the importance of having wealth and making decisions to make the transition to adulthood. Could you reflect upon that a little bit? I mean, you're a strong advocate for the CalHOPE program. What does it really mean in terms of planning your future, thinking about your pathways and so on?
I think that something that Devon didn't hit on is the fact that in California, our California HOPE program, the funds that, the youth receive, they can be used for anything, which is different than, in other states that have adopted the program. And I think that that's really, really powerful, specifically for the population that we're working with right now with foster youth, who have been, systemically and historically prevented from really being able to make their own choices and make their own decisions, even something as simple as, where they're going to live and what bed they're going to sleep in that night. And so I think, sorry, ask your question again.
Keep going. Keep going. I'm not going to interrupt this.
I'm just going to start ranting.
Go. No. Go for it.
Okay. I guess we have 30 minutes. So I think that specifically when it comes to this transitional age, I think that foster youth have it especially hard because when you grow up in a system where you're constantly transitioning from home to home, school to school, sibling to sibling, the transition to college or adulthood, hypothetically wouldn't seem like that big of a deal. But in practice, when you go from literally being raised by the state to having, no idea where you're going to live, the foster system to homelessness pipeline is such a huge issue, especially in somewhere like California, especially in somewhere like LA, that, these youth really have no support. Once you turn 18, you are out of the system, you don't know where you're going to sleep, you don't know where you're going to get the next meal. And so, even a one-time injection fund of only a couple $1,000s is really going to make that world of difference because maybe I have enough to rent a room, maybe I have enough to, get a meal, and maybe that can be enough for me to start dreaming of what I want for tomorrow. Maybe that can be enough for me to start, putting in that one college application or putting in that one job application. And even if it's not quite yet building that, career or, long-term college goal, it's really important to just feel like Devon said, like somebody is investing in you, even when you feel like your parents haven't.
So for all of us, when we're at that age, we are all working with issues of uncertainty, trying to find agency, and I think just really beautifully underline what that might be for someone who's gone through the foster system and the uncertainty that can provide. You highlighted the issue of you can do what you want with the money, generally speaking, but other states don't do that. Let's get into this about the role of control, restriction of the use of baby bonds versus supporting people as they make decisions. This really seems essential.
Yeah, we sort of just philosophically believe that unrestricted cash across the board is the best way to administer a program, both philosophically because we're not experts in anyone else's lives. People are going to be experts in their own lives, obviously. But also just like administratively, that's very difficult to require, right? We know this from the guaranteed income pilots where we've seen that unrestricted use of the funds that one received led to really good outcomes. We know this from the child tax credit example where people received essentially a guaranteed income from the federal government. We know that people spent the money in ways that were really constructive for themselves, and we saw that child poverty decreased in half within a matter of months. That philosophy still applies to what is sort of by design a wealth-building venture. But again, the piece that I think was really influential, at least for the policymakers, was this realization that you're not going to be able to build wealth if you're struggling to meet everyday expenses, right? So as Amaris said, if you need to use the funds to stay housed for a month, that's really meaningful. And just because it doesn't lead to home ownership necessarily doesn't mean that it's not a useful investment. So it was really important for us to ensure that the funds were unrestricted. And then when and we'll get into this I'm sure as well, we've made a really intentional effort. Our organization and another organization called End Child Poverty California have gone in together to ensure that young people who stand to benefit from the program themselves are directly informing the way that the program is designed and implemented. We sort of tested the value proposition of whether the funds should be restricted or not. And it was very clear that folks did not want the funds to be restricted, right? And I think that was yet another point in the column of us knowing that we were going in the right direction to make sure that we weren't trying to place constraints on a resource that really is coming in at a point where it's a real inflection point for young people to receive the funds when they're 18, right? Or be able to at least withdraw the funds when they're 18. The stakes are quite high at that age, as you've alluded to. So again, it just seemed both philosophically and practically, and for desired policy outcomes, that trying to restrict the funds was essentially a non-starter among advocates and ultimately among policymakers as well here in California. But in contrast, other programs like the Connecticut program, which was the first baby bonds program, structured very differently, does not seed money in children who are already alive. It started with newborns, so it's going to be a generation before those funds are ultimately accessed, is rather restrictive with how the funds can be used. And I think we'll see, in 15 years or so, what the outcomes are. But I'm always a believer that we don't need to be terribly prescriptive with how people use money. People are going to be experts in their own lives, ultimately.
There are multiple sources of the reasons behind the restrictions. But when we're talking about young people, there's some very young people-centric ideas and beliefs about young people that might lead to some arguing for restrictions. How do you argue against that in your advocacy efforts? How do you represent young people? How do you talk about the potential of young people and enabling them to make this decision?
Yeah, so I think to kind of contextualize what the amazing points that Devon brought up within lived experience, I think that it's really important, and I know we're going to talk about risk-taking later, but I think it's really important to realize that when you grow up low income, when you grow up in the foster care system, you don't have the privilege of taking risks. You don't have the privilege of taking risks with your money, with your education, with your siblings. You make one mistake, you're kicked out of this home and on to the next, And so I think when you look at, in contrast, the youth that we're kind of modeling this program after who receive these trust funds and the kind of youth who, have lived in the same home for all of their lives, who have gone to the same school district for their whole lives, they have that privilege of taking risks with their money. They have the privilege of, asking their parents or guardians, oh, can I borrow a couple $1,000s for this startup? Can I, spend a few $100s and go on my Europe trip? And it's like foster youth do not have that whatsoever. And so to be finally given that opportunity by the same state that, in a lot of ways has kind of led to kind of detrimental effects, through the foster care system, it's almost this liberative feeling of, finally having real investment, finally somebody genuinely believing in you and in your decision-making capabilities, and finally telling you that you're not so different than, your peers who were given all of these privileges.
So at the same time, we're not perfect decision makers. None of us at any stage of our life. People who with means will use financial advisors and so on. And so even when we are in a position to take risks, we need support in order to make those decisions and so on. And we'll talk about this in the next panel when we talk about, you know, building upon this natural proclivity of young people to become entrepreneurs. We still need support to get there and so on. And so in terms of supporting young people with an unrestricted amount of money that's coming, what have you thought about in terms of helping them?
Well, to answer that question, we really figured, again, we're not going to be the experts on what supports young people are going to need. So, like I mentioned, we retained the services of a couple of dozen young people who stood to benefit from the program. We called them the Youth Panel of Experts, and compensated them for their time and expertise, of course. But it's been a years-long effort to answer questions like this, questions around what supports are going to be necessary, what our outreach strategy can be to ensure that the uptake for the program is successful, what are the long-term questions that we need to be asking and answering to make sure that we're actually evaluating the program properly. And one of the main things that emerged was proactively, it was not something that we posed, was that young people seem to want financial coaching and education to make sure that they can equip themselves with the necessary tools and knowledge to make the most of this limited opportunity. And again, it's worth noting that the financial coaching is made very clear by the young people, not mandatory as a condition of receiving the funds, but something that is readily available, easily accessible, and ongoing, that can be, again, used to make sure that they're able to make the most of the opportunity. So what we've decided to do as a consequence of that, because we wanted to be responsive, is ensure that we're going to make sure that everyone who is eligible for these funds and receives the funds also has an accompanying financial coach that can provide that resource for them. But again, the question then emerged as soon as the proposition was raised around financial coaching, is this something that should be gate kept? Is this something that you have to clear in order to be able to receive the funds? And again, the answer was overwhelmingly no. And we believe in that. Right? So that's the main thing. That's going to be the main support that we provide, but I think it's a big one.
And then to add on to what Devon said, I think it's really, really important that we acknowledge that young foster youth and system-impacted youth want to be educated. It's not that, we just somehow hate education and so that's the reason why we don't graduate high school. It's that systemically we have been, kind of forbidden, very much gate-kept from being able to make the decision to go to school just because you're trying to stay alive. And so I think it's really important to, notice and name that, and to also say, yes, we are going to provide these services for you. And if you want, you can learn, how to invest this money, how you can learn how to open a bank account. You can learn how to do all of these things that were previously never open to you just because, of the family system that you grew up in.
I mean, also just notice a name, a theme here from the first session and from here, and it's going to continue on the third, is that when we are young, when we are of your wonderful age, we have incredible skills, abilities, willing to take risk, want to learn, think differently, can explore, challenge. We still need support. We still need scaffolding. It doesn't matter what background we're from. It doesn't matter that we still need this. And rather than, as Kyle mentioned, leave it by chance, we know a lot how we can design these kinds of things. How do you make coach, since it's voluntary, but there's probably still going to be barriers to that. So how do you think about providing coaching in a way where it's voluntary, but there aren't barriers that will prevent someone who wants it from actually accessing it?
Yeah, I think it's a really important question that we're going to have to continue to work through. But I think the supply of availability is going to be very important. If we want no wrong door to enter the resource, right? I think we have to make sure that there are many, not to use a highway metaphor like we tend to do, but there have to be a lot of on-ramps into the financial coaching and education, right? No wrong place of entry to be able to receive it, but also a sufficient supply that the resources can be made readily available. You don't have to wait in line for many months. We want to make sure that folks can access it quickly. And I think that's the worry, because I think if we underinvest in the supply of financial coaches, that's going to be an issue. But if we also underinvest in the outreach strategy to get people in the door in the first place, that's also going to be an even bigger issue, because then folks actually won't be able to receive the funds in the first place. So I think the way that we implement programs in the state has oftentimes been challenging. I think one of the biggest learning lessons from all of our work as advocates over the last few years has been that getting something passed is really just kind of getting to the 50-yard line in many ways, and that the way that we engage in program design and implementation is oftentimes just as important. And we've seen massive investments from the state on amazing programs that are designed to help young people, but ultimately, if folks don't access the funds, if they aren't aware of them, if there's continued distrust that's sown between the relationship of communities and government, we're going to continue to see uptake rates that are not satisfactory. And unfortunately, I think my worry is in a time that we're in where we have fiscal uncertainty moving forward, that programs that don't have sufficient uptake end up on the chopping block. And so that's my worry, not just for this program, though I think we will be able to take some lessons from previous failures and implement them here, hopefully. But existing programs that are already, that have been around for a handful of years now, that have really good intentions and significant investment, but ultimately haven't been able to yield the impact that we hope that they would.
And there are people in this room who are working exactly what you're talking about in other kinds of investments that the state of California has made. Amaris, I know we didn't talk about this in the preamble, but given where we're at now, if you can imagine a financial coaching service that's available to you, but that's relevant to you and your concerns and needs, what would you think about? How would you imagine that?
Yeah, we talked a lot about this on the panel of experts because I think we were all very into this idea of, oh, it's free and it's financial coaching. Oh, teaching what to do with my money, money man. It's a lot like that. I think it's very much just like, okay, teach me what to do with my money. I have no idea what to do with money.
That's true for all of us.
Yeah. I think it's just, we talked a lot about it being, having the option for it to be virtual or in person. That way, you have as much flexibility as possible. I think definitely we talked about advertising it as being free. Nobody wants to reject something that's free. We also talked a lot about making sure that they're using youth-friendly language and that the financial coaches who these young people are working with are trained to specifically be working with foster youth and system-impacted youth in specific, just because there are so many, developmental issues and, mental health issues that can come about because of, trauma from the system. And so it's really important that you have a financial coach who doesn't make you feel like, you're stupid, or who makes you feel like you're not worth the money, like the state is not investing in the right person. And so I definitely think that that's an important aspect. Let me think. I think we also talked a lot about having the option to switch, like if you don't like your coach, being able to request another one. A lot of what we talked about was just about having the option and having the freedom of choice and autonomy in a space where you aren't often given it.
Excellent. Thank you. Would love to be a fly on the wall in some of these meetings as you were planning. We have just a few minutes left before we let them talk. Can we step back a little bit to the concept of baby bonds and making investments for young people? And there is a equity argument, a justice argument, but there's also a developmental argument. And given the topic of our day, to what extent can a developmental argument play a role here in your efforts? And what do you think would be helpful?
Yeah, I think we've touched on it a little bit in the sense that having a semblance of economic security allows someone to pick their head up and think about their own future, right? Like, I think it transforms one's conception of themselves and their place in the world, hopefully. I think, again, the idea of the state investing in people, again, changes the way that you perceive yourself and your role in society writ large. I would imagine that we talk about risk-taking as well, and that being an important piece in the developmental cycle for young people. And again, we've also talked about how that risk-taking ability is constrained, and because the stakes become much higher. Again, I think there's probably an argument to be made that you're creating space for people to grow into their own at a rate that is faster when you provide more opportunities for risk-taking and adventurous behavior in a constructive way, because we're providing a semblance of a safety net that allows people to try things and fail. And that's got to be important for one's development as they're going into, through adolescence into adulthood, I would imagine.
Thanks, Devon. Do you want the final word on this, Amaris?
Oh, sure. I think that, just going back to what I've been talking about this whole time, autonomy is such a huge, huge issue that foster youth, really, really struggle with. I think that, as Devon has said multiple times, just knowing that you have this safety net of, a few $1,000s is so important, because now you know that, even if you, are having a rainy day, you still have that couple $1,000 to just get you through. And I think it's really important because you no longer have to worry about your immediate needs. And again, you can start focusing on your future. And so I think it, even if the door is closed, it opens a window. And I think that's really, really powerful for people who have, struggled through their whole lives.
And the rainy days are going to come for all of us. I think that was a really good point that you made. Why don't we open it for Q&A? I'm sure there's a lot of things that you want to ask these folks. Mr. Moore, I'll hand you mine.
Two quick observations and a question. The first observation is, in San Francisco, you've got My Path as a national expert in youth financial coaching. So another great thing coming out of California. Oh yeah, all right. Andy Moore, National League of Cities. The other, the sad observation is that more than 20 years ago, the Congress passed and created education and training vouchers for young people in the foster care system. And while it's definitely not, it's insufficiently funded, this idea was present that young people need support at that age of transition, and it's only in the foster care system that exists. It doesn't exist in juvenile justice, with the major exception of Pell Grants. It doesn't exist in higher ed. So it's really, it's a unique policy option out there to support the next developmental step. But the question I was going to ask is that, and I might be going down a granular chain here, but I think baby bonds are a cousin of college savings accounts, and there's really strong evidence, and this kind of picks up themes that Kyle brought up earlier, strong evidence that the existence of college savings accounts has a behavioral change effect to make people believe that they can go to college and succeed in college. So I'm just wondering how you connect with that in the way you run CalHOPE.
Yeah, absolutely. Such a good question. Thank you. So yes, we've been involved in the state's CSA program, Children's Savings Accounts program. It's called CalKids. It's a nearly $2 billion investment that seeds money in, creates accounts for all newborns in the state, but also provides a couple $100s for low-income kids, foster youth, homeless kids as well. There's absolutely a connection for bringing people from point A to point B, and that sort of leading to an incentivization for going to higher education. I think the way that we try to engage with it a little bit is in the outreach efforts, because I think there's been challenges with any statewide program in a state this big, obviously with limited resources. How do we ensure that when we're enrolling people into HOPE accounts that they're also availing themselves of CalKids and vice versa, right? I think we've been in partnership with a lot of folks in the Treasurer's office who have been doing really good work trying to streamline some of these programs for the uptake to make sure that we're not allowing these programs to exist in silos, because that's been the status quo for far too long. And to the extent that we're able to put these programs under one roof such that there's no example of someone availing themselves of one program but not the other when they're eligible for both, I think we're going to have better uptake across the board. And so my hope is we can actually save money with the outreach efforts by streamlining them together, because it's really expensive to conduct outreach, as you know probably better than most. It's extremely expensive to reach kids in a state that's this large, and again, when there's so much distrust that exists between communities and government, that if we're able to provide the suite of programs that people are eligible for, I think we'll have better outcomes for folks. But yeah, we're pretty involved in it, and it's a tremendous opportunity to provide money for folks, but also to your point, to create sort of the long-term incentive for actually going to college maybe you wouldn't otherwise. I think it's a real impact.
Hi, everybody. I'm Nia Westbay from DC with the National Collaborative for Transformative Youth Policy. And I had many thoughts as I told my table, but I think the question I want to ask you all to reflect on is some of the narrative change work that maybe you're trying to do in alignment here, because I feel like you all sort of alluded to it but didn't speak to it directly, that there's a lot of really harmful and racist narratives about people of color, about poor people, that are creating this framework where folks want to put restrictions and want to put requirements and all this other kind of stuff. I think particularly in this setting, there's also a set of narratives around adolescence and the value of investing in older young people versus investing in babies that is at play here. And that sort of, all of that plays into then how, to what extent we're able to get these programs passed and, you know, moved into policy. So I would just love to hear thoughts that you all have about how we're pushing on those narratives to get policymakers in a better space to be doing this kind of work. Because the evidence has long been there that this works.
Absolutely, and even just speaking of my own personal experience, I think when Andrew and I met, one of the reasons why I was so excited to come here and have our conversations was because I think that I wasn't actually familiar with a lot of the research on brain development that happens like post 16 years old. Because I think there is a really prevailing narrative that, you know, we understand like the first 5 development narrative, and I think there is a prevailing belief that after that point, the die is cast and you sort of can't intervene, right? Like that's a very prevailing myth. Even among like economic mobility advocates, right? Thankfully, we know that that's not true, and there's plenty of evidence to support that. But it is a really big challenge with anti-poverty policy, mainly because, and we see this, that investing in young people is a much easier sell to policymakers than it is to invest in adolescents and certainly adults, despite the fact that we know, again, that these interventions really do work. On the broader narrative, though, I think we spend a lot of time thinking about how we combat what we call the deservedness trope that we're all familiar with, right? And I think so much of the conversations around restrictions on use of funds are tied to deservedness. You know, does someone deserve to have autonomy with their cash? Do we trust people with money? All of these things are obviously racially coded and class coded. We know this. I think the way that we push back on it, and though we have to do it at scale, and that ends up being the biggest challenge, I think, for advocacy organizations, and means we have to do it collaboratively, is that we try to produce first-person content, op-eds, videos, whatever it might be, that allow people to tell their own story in their own words, three-dimensionally, discuss their hopes and dreams. And we've been able to do that through this youth panel, where we've had 6 folks publish op-eds in major newspapers across the state, Cal Matters, Sacramento Bee, and the like, which has been great. And I think it's done the work of socializing the program, but I think it's also, like I mentioned earlier, I think somewhat protected the program against cuts when we were able to put faces and names to the beneficiaries of programs like this. I think it makes it a tougher thing to put on the chopping block. But the narrative is a huge issue. It's a huge issue for all economic mobility policy. And I don't think that young people are exempt from that, even if the frame is a little bit different. I think especially for adolescents, again, because again, I really think that there is a belief that like the pie is baked by the time you get to adolescence, right? And I think to the extent that we can combine the science that dismisses that claim, along with the first-person storytelling that can humanize it and make it more accessible to folks, I think we can make some traction there. But again, I think the scale is going to be the challenge that we do that, because these beliefs are very deeply embedded, and I don't think any one organization or one program is going to be capable of shifting culture in a really meaningful way. But if we can maybe provide an example and a model for others to replicate and other programs to replicate, maybe we can make some traction.
Yeah, really quickly to just kind of hit on how we're kind of addressing that internalized narrative within the foster youth. On the youth panel of experts, we talked a lot about harmful stereotypes and how in the rollout, how are we going to kind of like address that in, you know, outreach and things like that. We talked a lot about like, you know, like historical context, the welfare queen, stereotypes like that. And we kind of really debunked this idea that the sins of our parents therefore pass on to the child, and that just because my parents struggled economically and they might be low income, it doesn't necessarily mean that I have to be and that I am inherently bad because this is the neighborhood, this is the community that I grew up in. And so I definitely think that just the funds themselves are also inherently changing that narrative within the youth by telling them that, you know, you are worth something and you do not have to kind of stay here. And by not restricting the funds, it's definitely telling them that you deserve autonomy and like you don't deserve to be, you know, kind of restrained in something that allegedly is supposed to be, you know, giving you freedom.
One final quick question.
Carrie Lamont with Unite LA. We're in Los Angeles County. We've run the financial aid campaign for Los Angeles County for the last 20 years and also have co-convened an effort, the Opportunity Youth Collaborative, focused on transition-age foster youth education and employment. So everything you're talking about is very relevant to our work. When you're talking about the financial coaching piece, I'm wondering if there's an opportunity to embed specific information for foster youth and how they navigate the higher education system. Andy was talking about the Chafee grant, I think, and there's been efforts in California to create other other scholarships for foster youth, special Cal grant exemptions. Like at this point, community college is essentially free for foster youth, but we haven't had that messaging campaign to be able to share that information with young people in the child welfare system. So, the national message is college is so unaffordable, and we haven't been able to really say, here's all of the resources that we have amassed in California that foster youth are eligible for and not getting, including there's like a special earned income tax credit for foster youth. So just a thought on like how those resources might also be kind of integrated into this financial coaching to support with college going.
I think whether it's in the financial coaching or any sort of concerted effort to help people avail themselves of these resources, we have to do it, right? We have to do it. And my hope is that financial coaching, we're still trying to figure out what that's going to look like in practice, whether it's narrow to just how you're going to spend your $4,500 to sort of kickstart your life as an adult, or whether it's whether it's more expansive and saying, okay, well, yes, here's this money, but here's all these other resources. That second step has to take place from somewhere. And I think that it's probably, I think that can exist through this program. I hope it exists through this program. But if it's also under the broader umbrella of the programs that are being administered by the Treasurer's Office, whether it's CalKids, whether it's HOPE accounts, whether it's Cal accounts, which is going to create bank accounts for unbanked Californians, which is a really exciting new program. All of these things, I think, speak to a need of awareness and outreach and delivering of the money that we've already allocated to programs like this. So I think the answer is yes. The question, I think, is where and how. And my hope, again, is that it can exist through the HOPE programs, financial coaching. But if it doesn't exist through that avenue, it has to exist somewhere else because, to your point, if we're not combating the narrative around accessibility, people create walls in their own minds about what's possible, right?
And just to flag for the rest of the folks, the meeting we met was focused on benefit access. I know this is what you do, and that's the effort of a lot of other folks in this room. It's not on the stage today, but it's definitely an issue that's relevant to all of this. I also just quickly flag this question of coaching and how to provide the right coaching to take full advantage of the developmental skills and abilities of young people is going to be a theme that we're going to be carrying for the next session when we talk about entrepreneurship.